Last time, we looked at the event that defined the generations that were active in the second half of the 5th century. The protracted religious struggles between the Zoroastrian Sassanian Empire and the Christian noble lords of Armenia, who belonged to that empire and owed their loyalty to it. Interpreting the events of the time by means of their Christian worldview, and drawing heavily on the biblical books of the Maccabees, as well as the book of Daniel, Lazar and Yerishe invented a paradigm whereby the Christian religion is fundamental to and inseparable from Armenian identity, where the noble lords owe their first loyalty to the church and God, bound to one another by means of a holy covenant mediated by the church, and willing to heroically die a martyr's death in order to defend their Hayrani Orenk. This archetypal paradigm transcended its own time and was used by later generations of Armenians to understand and identify themselves and their place in the world, to create a hierarchy of values, and remains a potent force in Armenian self-understanding up until the present day. Before introducing the histories we'll look at today, those of Sebeos and Ghewond, we need to talk a little bit about the major transformation that took place in the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean in the middle of the first millennium, and came to define the region ever since. Perhaps the best way to do this is by means of maps. So here you see a map of the Sassanian and Byzantine empires, and you can see that they essentially divide the world of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East between them, their borders shifting depending on the ascendancy of one or another empire at any given time. Armenia is, of course, caught in between the two, in the part where the color fades between dark gray and yellow, which indicates areas where the borders shifted due to warfare. For this reason, Armenia is talked about as a contested space in late antiquity. And these political conditions define the perspective of many of the historians we've looked at so far, as we've had occasion to note in previous lectures. So you can see Armenia is basically here. And it's in this space between the Sassanian Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. This map focuses on the years between 590 to 628 AD, when the Byzantine and Sassanian empires were engaged in near constant warfare, called by some historians the last great war of antiquity, after which both sides were left depleted and vulnerable. And you know what comes next. It's precisely at this time that the Arab armies, unified under the new religious banner of Islam, rapidly conquer and subsume the Sassanian Empire and surrounding regions, including much of the Byzantine Empire. And so this map here shows the rapidity of their expansion between just 30 to 100 years after the death of Muhammad. You can see by following the color scheme and successive decades, basically, the speed at which they took over most of the Sassanian and even into some of the Byzantine Empire, North Africa. Armenia and Armenians, once again, are caught in the middle and are forced to think quickly on their feet in order to respond to the new reality. Under the leading prince of the day, Theodore Rushduni, they make a treaty with the Arabs in the 7th century, whereby they accept caliphal suzerainty and are to send tribute and military support to the caliphate in exchange for peaceful relations with the new power and its protection. This initiates the gradual incorporation of Armenia into the caliphal or Islamic world, whereby Armenia, along with Iberia, which is Eastern Georgia, and Caucasian Albania, are eventually incorporated into the caliphate as a single large province called Armenia, which is ruled by a governor called the Vostidan or Amir, who's appointed by the caliph and acts as his representative in the north. And for more on all these developments, you should see the Armenian Christian History Lecture Series by Professor Irving that's on YouTube, the St. Narcissus YouTube channel. So how does one living at the time interpret this new reality? How do you make sense of what seemed to those living at the time like the end of the world? It certainly was the end of the world as they had known it up until then. Just 1 second here. So Sebeos is the first to respond to this changed reality. The history attributed to Sebeos is one of the first historiographical texts in any language to respond to the rapid rise of Islam and to try to make sense of it. As such, it holds great importance for scholars of the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean, Byzantium, and Islam. Remember that sources don't regularly become written in Arabic until the 8th century. So for the early history of Islam, scholars make use of texts in Syriac, Armenian, and Greek in order to try to construct as full a picture as possible, not only of what happened, but also of how those living through these events responded to and made sense of, interpreted what happened. Writing about Sebeos, scholar James Howard Johnston says, quote, "No other extant source which touches on the Arab conquest can match his account in its range, coherence, precision, and apparent sobriety." So this text is of extreme value for scholars interested in the early history of Islam, especially the Arab conquest. And so you can see on the screen the additions. So on the left, the Armenian history attributed to Sebeos. We'll talk about why it's called that. You can see it was translated by Robert Thompson. And there's also a detailed historical commentary. So the first volume is the text and translation. Second volume is the historical commentary, talking about its importance, relevance, comparing Sebeos' account with other sources from the time and what's known in general about the history he talks about. You can also see the Sophene books volume, so translated by Robert Bedrosian with the English on one side and the Armenian on the other side. This is volume 1, and volume 2 will come out soon. And I want to mention an article that benefited me greatly when I was preparing for this lecture, which is by Tim Greenwood, a historian at the University of St. Andrews. Sassanian Echoes and Apocalyptic Expectations, a reevaluation of the Armenian history attributed to Sebeos. If anyone wants a PDF copy, you can email me and I'll send it to you. But a lot of what I'm going to say is based on that, actually. Tim Greenwood has done, in the last 20 years, he's devoted his scholarly attention to the Armenian histories, especially starting with Sebeos and going up until about the 11th century. A lot of the ones we're going to be looking at, he's done very detailed study and is a great scholar to know about if you're interested in going deeper in this period. So there are some problems with the author or identification of the author and the text. So let's talk about that just a little bit. So it's conventionally ascribed, this history, to a bishop named Sebeos. He was a Bagratuni bishop in the 7th century who was a signatory to the canons of the Council of Devine, or one of the councils of Devine, this one in 645. The first time there's a reference to a historian called Sebeos is from Stepanos Staronetsi, writing in the early 11th century. When he lists his historical predecessors at the beginning of his work, he mentions a History of Heraclius, said to be by Bishop Sebeos. And this is repeated by subsequent historians and chroniclers, such as Giragos Kontaketsi. The identification of the history now known as the History of Sebeos with this History of Heraclius, and the identification of its author as the Bagratuni bishop Sebeos in the 7th century, was made in 1833 by a scholar, Shah Khatunian, and when the text was published, it was published as such in 1851. But today, neither the identification of the text nor its attribution to Sebeos, the Bagratuni bishop, is accepted by scholars, although the text is still referred to as such. And that's why you could see it's called, in the published edition, the Armenian history attributed to Sebeos. So how did they come to determine that it was different? Well, the 10th century historian Uftanes also knew the history of Heraclius, the one that Stepanos Staronetsi referred to, and he used a passage from it in his history. And there's also a couple other small fragments of that text that survive in liturgical manuscripts. So Robert Thompson made a study where he compared those fragments that survive to this text that we have, the Armenian history attributed to Sebeos, and found they don't actually correspond. And so it's been determined that that one that Stepanos Staronetsi and Uftanes knew, it doesn't exist in full anymore. And we have this other history that overlaps with some of the contents. And so we just call it the history attributed to Sebeos or Sebeos' history. We don't really know exactly who the author is. Doesn't matter too much for our purposes. But what do we know about the author from the text itself? What can we gather? So he definitely comes across as being a senior cleric, and probably with ties to the Mamigonian family. In his detailed study that I referred to earlier, Tim Greenwood mentions that the patron was perhaps Hamazasp Mamigonian, a 7th century Armenian prince who's described near the end of the book as a lover of reading and study. Antertsaser yev usum naser. So it's probably a bishop, probably a senior bishop, and one with ties to the Mamigonian family. So that is a significant difference from the traditional thing we thought, which was that it was a bishop associated with the Bagratuni. So how about the contents of this text? So it extends from the Armenian rebellion of 572, led by Vartan Mamigonian, not the one of the 5th century, but a later one, and extends down to the volatile conditions within Armenia in the spring of 655 AD. And there's 4 additional short notices that are tacked onto the end, which ultimately bring the work up to 661. It recounts episodes from the lives of prominent Armenian princes and Catholicoi, and reports a selection of the military engagements and warfare in areas where Armenians lived. But the scope of this history is much broader than just Armenian history, the kind of more focused attention on Armenia and Armenian affairs that we've seen in some of the other histories we've looked at so far. By contrast, this covers big international events of the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean region from the late 6th to mid 7th century, involving the Byzantine, Sassanian, and Arab Islamic worlds. The chronology of the text you could kind of divide into 3 parts. So it starts with the transition of power from the Persian Shah Khosrov Anushirvan, who reigned for a long time, as you can see on the screen, 531 to 579, and the ensuing civil war that came about after his death until his grandson, Khosrov II, takes over. And then comes the middle section, which is devoted to the 30 or so years of warfare between the Byzantine and Sassanian empires. And finally, the last section where Heraclius has his great victory, but it's short-lived because then you have the appearance of Muhammad, the rise of Arab power, and the overthrow of the Sassanian Empire, and the ascendancy of the Arab Islamic Caliphate in the region. So there's a number of different sources that this author used to compile his history, and Tim Greenwood has broken them down into various categories. And this will be interesting for us to spend just a little bit of time looking at, because it'll give us a sense of the way in which some of these ancient historians composed their histories. They didn't just sit down to write things as they remembered or as they knew or saw them. They dealt with sources, just like historians today deal with a variety of sources and then compose a narrative. So what are some of these sources that we could identify in Sebeos? Well, there's documents. There's different letters exchanged between, for example, Catholicos Gomidas and Modestos, who was the head of the church in Jerusalem. There's also a lengthy document defending the Armenian doctrinal position, composed by Armenian bishops and sent from Catholicos Nerses III to Emperor Constans. So Greek and Armenian exchanges. And then there's what could be called a royal history, which is Sebeos must have had access to some work concerning Sassanian royal history that talked about the individual Sassanian shahs, their achievements, their major events, and their character. And then there are biographies related to major and famous Armenian princes and noble lords, mostly the Bagratuni, Mamigonian, and Rushtuni families. And this material is a mix of what we might call more historical, descriptive material and more epic material, meant to praise the prowess and courage and strength of the noblemen. There's also a list of Persian commanders and governors appointed over Armenia, which helps to get structure to the work. There's attention to the various Catholicoi, focusing on their place of origin, their various ecclesiastical appointments before they became Catholicos, their different building activities, and other activities they did while in office. And then there's another source that he had that must have dealt with the history of the Arab and Sassanian warfare when the Arabs were taking over the Sassanian Empire. And a source that talked about the early history of Muhammad and the rise of the Arabs into the region. A lot of these sources could have been written, and some of them might also have been oral, that then Sebeos, or whoever this author was, is putting together into a narrative for the first time. And then there's the compiler himself as the author, because as we've talked about all through this lecture series, the point of these histories is not to sit down and just say what happened. None of these historians are interested in just narrating events for the sake of narrating events. They all have their deeper purposes that guides why they choose the material they do, why they put it in the order they do, and how they interpret it. So what can we say were the purposes of this author? It's clear from the way that Sebeos structures his history and how he concludes it at the end, that he's advancing an apocalyptic perspective derived from the Bible, principally the book of Daniel. If you've read the book of Daniel, you'll remember that Daniel has visions, especially in the end of the book. The last part of the book is taken over by these visions of different beasts who come, and these are correlated with different empires who will rule the world at different times and then pass away because they're conquered by a new power that comes. So Sebeos uses this vision and applies it to his own times. So there's 4 beasts that come, 4 ruling powers. The first beast, he says, is the kingdom of the West, which is the Romans. The second beast is the kingdom of the East, the Sassanians. The third beast, he's a little fuzzy on. It says it's Gog and Magog, drawing on these apocalyptic figures in the Bible. And he says it's the kingdom of the north. So from an Armenian perspective, we might understand the steppe peoples that lived above the Caucasus. And then he sees the coming of the Arabs as the fulfillment of the prophecy that they're the 4th beast. He says in bold, the 4th, arising from the south, is the kingdom of Ishmael, just as the archangel explained to Daniel. The 4th beast, the 4th kingdom shall arise, but shall be greater than all kingdoms, and it will consume the whole earth. This apocalyptic universal vision affected the content of his history. That's why he focuses so much on these global international events. He compiled together all the earlier material about the Sassanians, the Romans, all their history and warfare, because he's telling the history of these beasts, these various kingdoms that are ushering in the last age. And he ends his history with prophetic judgment on the 4th beast, quoting verses from the prophets Jeremiah and Isaiah. Then at the going out of the words, he says, the day of their destruction is close. The Lord has arrived upon them in readiness, and this too will be fulfilled in its own time. The sons of Ishmael will be consumed by fire. The foundations of their mountains, that is, the tyrannies of their great princes, will burst into flames. The author believed that the parousia, the second coming, was imminent, and that he himself was living in the end times. So, as such, Sebeos is the first writer to give a Christian apocalyptic perspective, at least in writing, to the coming of the Arabs to the region. But he wouldn't be the last. He'd be followed by many others in different languages of the Near East, especially Syriac. For example, there's a text, The Syriac Apocalypse, by one Pseudo-Methodius, which would become even more developed apocalyptic interpretations. So Sebeos is also important because he's represents one of the first Christian attempts to understand the Arab Islamic conquest and place it in the context of God's plan for human history, as defined by the Bible. So let's end this first part on Sebeos by looking at his specific description of Muhammad and the Arab conquests. We'll see how much time we have to get into all of this, because this is one of the very first written accounts of the Prophet Muhammad in any language. So he says, I shall speak of the stock of Abraham, not of the free one, but of that born from the handmaiden, concerning which the unerring divine word was fulfilled, his hands on all, and the hands of all on him. Then the 12 tribes of all the clans of the Jews went and gathered at the city of Odessa. When they saw that the Persian army had departed from them and had left the city in peace, they shut the gate and fortified themselves within. They did not allow the army of the Roman Empire to enter among them. Then the Greek king Heraclius ordered it to be besieged. When they realized that they were unable to resist him in battle, they parleyed for peace with him. Opening the gates of the city, they went and stood before him. Then he ordered them to go and remain in each one's habitation, and they departed. Taking desert roads, they went to Kachkastan, to the sons of Ishmael, summoned them to their aid, and informed them of their blood relationship through the testament of Scripture. But although the latter were persuaded of their close relationship, yet they were unable to bring about agreement within their great number, because their cults were divided from each other. So what's going on so far? So far, Sebeos sets it up as there's these Jews who are in the city of Odessa, and they're being besieged and attacked by Heraclius, the East Roman Emperor. And so they decide to go to Arabia, essentially, and seek help from their long-lost kinsmen, the Arabs, to see if they can unite together and join forces. But if they're not able to be successful, why? Because the Arab tribes are not themselves united with each other and wouldn't be able to put together a unified policy. At that time, a certain man from among those same sons of Ishmael, whose name was Muhammad, a merchant, as if by God's command, appeared to them as a preacher and the path of truth. He taught them to recognize the God of Abraham, especially because he was learned and informed in the history of Moses. Now, because the command was from on high, at a single order they all came together in unity of religion. Abandoning their vain cults, they turned to the living God, who had appeared to their father Abraham. So Muhammad legislated for them, not to eat carrion, not to drink wine, not to speak falsely, and not to engage in fornication. He said, with an oath, God promised this land to Abraham and his seed after him forever. And he brought about as he promised during that time while he loved Israel. But now you are the sons of Abraham, and God is accomplishing his promise to Abraham and his seed for you. Love sincerely only the God of Abraham, and go and seize your land which God gave to your father Abraham. No one will be able to resist you in battle, because God is with you. Then they all gathered in unison from Awila as far as Sur, which is opposite Egypt, and they went from the desert of Paran, 12 tribes, according to the tribes of the families of their patriarchs. They divided the 12,000 men, like the sons of Israel, into their tribes, 1,000 men from each tribe, to lead them into the land of Israel. They set off, camp by camp, according to each one's patriarchal line. Nabeut, Kedar, Abdul, Mabsam, Masmai, Iduma, Maseh, Kohdad, Teman, Yetur, Napes, and Kedma. These are the tribes of Ishmael. They reached Araboth of Moab in the territory of Reuben, for the Greek army had camped in Arabia. Falling on them unexpectedly, they put them to the sword and put to flight Theodos, the brother of the emperor Heraclius. Then they returned and camped in Arabia. All the remnants of the people of the sons of Israel gathered and united together. They formed a large army. Following that, they sent messages to the Greek king saying, God gave that land to our father Abraham as a hereditary possession and to his seed after him. We are the sons of Abraham. You have occupied our land long enough. Abandon it peacefully, and we shall not come into your territory. Otherwise, we shall demand that possession from you with interest. But the emperor did not agree. He did not respond appropriately to their message, but said, "This land is mine. Your lot of inheritance is the desert. Go in peace to your land." He began to collect troops, about 70,000, appointed as general over them one of his trusted eunuchs, and ordered them to go to Arabia. He commanded them not to fight with them, but to look to their own defense until he should have gathered other troops to send to their assistance. But when they reached the Jordan and crossed into Arabia, they left their camps on the riverbank and went on foot to attack their army. The latter posted part of their force in ambush on either side and arranged the multitude of their tents around their camp. Bringing up the herds of camels, they tethered them around the camp and their tents and bound their feet with cords. This was the fortification of their camp. The others, though wearied from their march, were able at certain places to penetrate the fortification of the camp and began to slaughter them. Unexpectedly, those lying in ambush rose up from their places and attacked them. Fear of the Lord fell on the Greek army, and they turned in flight before them. But they could not flee because of the density of the sand, since their feet sank in up to their shins, and there was great distress from the heat of the sun, and the enemy's sword pursued them. So all the generals fell and were slain. The number of the fallen was more than 2,000. A few of them escaped and fled to a place of refuge. And the text goes on to describe the Arab conquests in more detail, both of the Byzantines and then especially of the Sassanians. What's striking about the description? Well, there's a number of things we could talk about, but perhaps one of the most striking things is the close correlation made between the Jews and the Arabs. In Sebeos' mind, he puts together the two other monotheistic religions as they're almost inseparable in a way. The Arabs have their 12 tribes, just like the 12 tribes of Israel. And you can see how, in his perspective, they're basically taking over the land. So there's the promise made to Abraham that that land will belong to his descendants forever. Well, one of his sons had it for a long time. And now it's the time for the next son. And in some early Christian writings about Islam, Islam is presented as a Christian heresy, basically. What's also interesting here with Sebeos is that everything is described as being done in accordance with God's will. That he doesn't say that what they received, is really, it was a demon talking to them or they were misguided or something like that. He's essentially interpreting what's happening as them in touch, really, in some way with the God of Abraham and taking what's their birthright, at least in the way that the text is presented to us. So anyone interested in seeing more about this early look from a Christian perspective at the rise of Islam, the rise of Muhammad and the Islamic conquests, I encourage you to look at this history. So the next one we're going to look at is the history of Levant. So let's start by talking about these editions that you see on the screen. So on the top left is a translation made in 1982 by Father Zalvan Arzumanyan with a nice commentary as well. And then next to it, you can see the Sophene Books edition, translated by Robert Bedrosian, again, English and Armenian together. There's a very detailed and nice French edition that also has the Armenian text. You can see the bibliography on the screen. Very detailed commentary for anyone looking for a good scholarly approach to the source. And then in the blue, you can see I'm indicating that there's a forthcoming translation and commentary by Sergio Laporta and Alison Vaca, who have basically done a team translation and a commentary, especially with reference to the importance of this history for Near Eastern Arab Islamic history. Because again, it covers the period of the Caliphate and Armenians' involvement with it. And that's due out, I think, next year. Excuse me. So Revlon's, oh my God, 1 second. Revlon's history has not formed part of the core body of works that have been privileged by modern scholars who tend to favor the 5th century Golden Age early texts or the period during the Bagratuni and Artsuni kingdoms, so in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries. So this is being rectified in modern years, thanks to the work of a number of scholars who have put a lot of focus on this so-called interregnum period between the fall of the Arshakuni kingdom and the rise of the Bagratuni. So Nina Garsoyan has a great book on this period, as do other scholars. So why might there not be attention paid to this history? Well, the key Armenian characters in the work tend to emerge without much introduction. They dominate the scene briefly, and then they disappear again, mostly appearing to enact some kind of heroic but ultimately doomed resistance to a campaign against one or another caliph or Byzantine emperor. So the history does not project the image of a powerful Armenian kingdom or record key events that could form part of a glorious national epic, which was the interest of most scholars in the 19th century, when the canons of Armenian literature were being formulated. As Tim Greenwood says, again, you can see on the bottom of the screen, this excellent article he wrote on the history of Levant. He says, if there's one salient characteristic uniting the different Armenians in the narrative, it is their powerlessness in the face of oppression. Those who challenge the state of affairs are killed or forced into exile. So naturally, it was neglected by scholars committed to constructing and promoting a national history. But that doesn't mean it can't be of great interest to us today. So let's say a little something about the author, date, context, and patronage of the work. So the standard view is that it was written in the late 8th century by an otherwise unknown Vartabed, Ghewond, at the commission of a figure of the Bagratuni house named Shapu. This is based on 3 features of the text. First, the chronology that it covers. Second, the title of the work, and a short colophon that comes at the end. So let's look at these. So here's the title on the left. Atmapanutun Revontia Medzi Vartabedi Hayots. Vor Haakas Yereveluin Mahmedi Yevesgani Norin. Te Vorbes Yevgamvorov Orinagav Diretsin Diazerats. Yeves Aravel Te Hayots Azkis. which translates to the History of Levant, the great Armenian Vartabed, concerning the appearance of Muhammad and his successors, as to how or in what manner they ruled the world, and especially our Armenian nation. So, Batma Panutun, a history. But then look over at the colophon. It's interesting. The teaching, Vartabedutun, of Ghewond, was accomplished for the sake of the annals of the house of Torgom, at the command of Lord Shapu Bakratuni, to the glory and praise of the all-holy Trinity, who is blessed now and forever. Amen. So who is the house of Torgom? This is, of course, the Armenian nation, as defined member according to the biblical genealogy of Haik being a descendant of Torgom, Togarma, in the book of Genesis. So we don't know anything about Ghewond apart from this colophon, really. But it's fascinating that in the colophon, the text is called a teaching, Vartabedutun. It's meant to be instructive, not just tell or narrate events. And that fits, again, with everything we've seen so far about the Armenian historical tradition. So the patron is a figure of the Bagratuni house. And in Tim Greenwood's assessment, which we can take for the purposes of this lecture, but there's other ways of understanding it. So he argues for a late 9th century date for when this history was written. And as we examine the text further, we'll see the relevance of that. So those who know Armenian history, what happens in the latter half of the 9th century that would make that so relevant? Everyone's muted, so no one can say anything. But I'm sure you're all thinking, well, obviously, the Bagratuni kingdom starts in the second half of the 9th century. And so Tim Greenwood does this fascinating reading of why Ghewond would have written this history about this earlier period in the light of the rise of the Bagratuni kingdom. Sometimes in maybe more nationalistic approaches, the rise of the Bagratuni kingdom is seen as being, a kingdom separate and independent from the caliphate that was able to finally break away and achieve independence of some sort. But that wasn't the case at all. The Bagratuni kings and later the Artsuni kings, they remained tightly integrated part of the caliphate and basically ruled as locally autonomous figures who still were under the suzerainty of the governor and the caliph, sent taxes, military support, everything as before, but had the right to be known as kings, as local kings in their territory. But we shouldn't imagine some kind of separate kingdom. And that's significant for the particular take that Ghewond, the particular perspective that Ghewond will take in his history. So Tim Greenwood says that this is a sophisticated composition, one that has been fashioned with great skill by its author in order to project a particular view of the past for contemporary political purposes. So what was that particular view of the past? Well, first, let's look at the contents. It opens with the death of Muhammad in 632 and stretches to 788 AD, ending with the election of Stephanos to the Catholicosate of Armenia. With the exception of the first 4 chapters, which overlap with the previous history of Sebeos, it's really the only substantial narrative account of this period in Armenian. Like Sebeos, it's of much broader interest and significance than just Armenian history. It contains a complete sequence of caliphs and constructs the entire history around their reigns, giving their years in office and offering short studies of their personal attributes, their major deeds and actions, the major events that happened during their reign, and especially those dealings they had with Armenia or Armenian noblemen. So that's the skeleton around which the rest of the history is written, the reigns of the caliphs. There's also great interest and attention given to the governor or commander, the Amir or Vostigan, who's in charge of Armenia, so Armenia, Eastern Iberia, and Caucasian Albania, the caliph's representative in the region. And usually the governor is represented as being oppressive and impious, whose actions cause great suffering on the local populace. High, unjust, and oppressive taxes is also a common theme. And it's interesting, modern scholarly research that has compared Ghewond's list of the caliphs and the governors of Armenia, compared that with numismatic evidence, meaning the evidence from coins that are coined by rulers, reveals that Ghewond's sequence and dates and everything is very, very, very accurate. So what does all this say? Well, for one thing, it shows how tightly integrated Armenia was at this time into the broader caliphal world. And how at home, really, in a sense, Ghewond and those like him of the day was with the broader Islamic world, in touch with the latest developments and their world being most affected by who the leaders of the caliphate or his representatives are over them. So you might think why he could have ordered the history based on the different Catholicoi of Armenia or the different noble princes, but he didn't. He did it based on the caliphs. So here's the opening of the work. It's very striking for an Armenian history. So he starts out like this. First and foremost were those who were named Amir al-Mu'minin. This is Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the believers. This is a title adopted by the caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab on his election in 634. And from Umar until the end of the caliphate as an institution, Amir al-Mu'minin was employed exclusively as the title of the caliph. So first and foremost were those who were named Amir al-Mu'minin, for after holding power for 20 years, Muhammad died. Muhammad was succeeded by Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman for a period of 38 years. You wouldn't know from reading that this is going to be an Armenian history written by an Armenian. And there's other sources and things we could compare this to at the time that would show, again, just how tightly integrated Armenia was to the wider Arab world at this time, or Islamic world at this time. One example we could mention, there's a commentary on the Gospel of John by Nonus of Nisibis, who was a famous Syriac theologian and apologist. It was commissioned by a Bagratuni prince, Bagarat, from 830 to 851. Those were his major years. So you have this Armenian prince commissioning a Syriac theologian to write a commentary on the Gospel of John, especially with theological and Christological purposes. What language is he going to choose? Obviously Armenian, right? No, it's Arabic. So it's written in Arabic. And it's not until about 100 years later that it's translated into Armenian. So what that means is that the noblemen and the princes, a lot of the educated, probably knew Arabic. We hear in Ghewond's history and other later histories that a lot of the noblemen would actually be raised at the courts of various Islamic leaders. And so they must have been fluent and comfortable in Arabic from a young age. Some of you who are familiar with later medieval history might know also of the custom of the nobleman receiving an Armenian name and an Arabic name. So there's several Artsruni princes, for example, Gagik, Abumravan Artsruni, or Gurgen Abu Belch Artsruni. So basically you get your Armenian name and your Arabic name. Okay, so it also comments, it has a lot to say about various Byzantine affairs, usually revolving around the characters and deeds of various emperors. But unlike the part having to do with the caliphs, it's very muddled and incomplete information, either inaccurate or very superficial, and usually only says anything about when the emperor is undergoing some kind of campaign in Armenia or dealing with Armenians. So what does this tell you? Obviously that for Levant or those like him at the time, the Byzantine Empire is way off and they don't know much about it. And it's a different world of sorts. It's not the immediate one that they're most connected to. Ghewond also, as mentioned, the early part of his history overlaps with the history of Sebeos. And he probably knew Sebeos and drew from him that history, but he reworked it and changed some parts. And if you study how he made those changes, what are the differences he introduced or not? Usually, the changes he makes are to emphasize the untrustworthiness of Byzantium in its dealings with Armenia. So he has a very negative opinion of Byzantium and essentially vilifies them. And this correlates well with his Bagratuni, pro-Bagratuni perspective. The Bagratuni house is always emerging as being loyal to the caliphs, as we will see more later. So he concludes this section on the Arab campaigns into Armenia and wars with Byzantium with the following quote that's on the screen. After that time, the courage of the king of the Greeks grew weak because he realized that his authority had been subverted by the Lord, and he did not attempt to advance against Ishmael anymore. So the underlying message is clear. Byzantium was permanently and swiftly expelled from Armenia after mishandling its principal client, Armenia, so badly that they sided with the Arabs instead. And in general, you find this kind of antipathy towards Byzantium throughout the text. There's also this lengthy correspondence inserted into Ghewond's history between the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, who reigned 717 to 741, and the Caliph Omar II, who reigned 717 to 720, in which the emperor responds to specific questions on Christian beliefs and practices posed in an earlier letter from the Caliph. So it's very interesting that this document is preserved in Ghewond's history, because it has nothing whatsoever to say about Armenia or Armenians. It's strictly a theological document, apologetic document, where the Byzantine emperor or bishops writing on his behalf is responding to theological questions and differences of opinion and belief made by the caliph or the Muslim scholars writing on his behalf. So there's 5 different versions of this document that survive. So there's the one in Ghewond's history in Armenian. There's 2 Arabic versions. There's a Latin version, and then I don't even know how to pronounce this, Alquiamiado, which is basically one Romance language or another of the time written in Arabic script. So some early version of Spanish or French or something like that, but written with Arabic letters. So this would obviously come from Andalusia or Spain. So no one really knows what original language this document was written in. Those who've studied the Armenian text see strong evidence that it was indeed translated from Greek because of certain phrases and the way certain words are used. A recent dissertation by Seon-Young Kim from Catholic University of America studied the Arabic versions and some of the later versions derived from them. In her opinion, it was originally an Arabic text that all later versions are made from. And she argued that there was a Syriac Melkite figure in the mid-8th century who composed this. So these kind of correspondences or documents back and forth arguing theological differences between Christians and Muslims becomes more common over time. And this is one of the early such examples preserved in Levant. Tim Greenwood, again, who members had argued for a 9th century date, he says, well, why would you put this document in? And he sees that perhaps it was a kind of response to the fact that some Armenians, as some Christians from every tradition, are converting to Islam. And so you put this document in the text to give a defense and response to the kind of critiques that Islamic scholars are making against Christian theology. So let's look at a text from Levant, because time is passing quickly tonight. So, insurrection or loyalty. This is one of the major issues that comes up throughout Levant's history. And we'll see, just keep the question in mind and as we read this. So he says, as soon as the Armenian nobles learned of this success, some military success they had, they all agreed to pursue the imprudent plan of insurrection. They thought that the fall of the Arab domination was at hand, especially since they were misled by a certain monk who, moved by the spirit of seduction, falsely prophesied, saying, behold, the hour of your salvation has come. And now shortly, the scepter of the kingdom shall be restored once again to the house of Torgom, and through you revenge shall be taken from the Arab nation. Do not be afraid of them because of the inferiority of your number, for one of your men shall be able to persecute thousands, and 2 of your men shall frighten tens of thousands. It shall be the Lord himself who will fight for you. Be encouraged and do not be afraid. Thus, day after day, he entertained them by relating false visions and deceitful desires. In general, they all went along with him, believing in what he was saying and regarding him as a prophet. Then, being led astray, they all began to provoke the high constable Simbat, son of Ashot, a Bakratuni, in order to obtain his consent for the insurrection. Simbat was unwillingly diverted from his firm conviction and intransigent position, and yielded to the illusions of this impostor and frenzied man. Now all the Armenian nobles assembled at a certain place and made an oath to each other, agreeing with a solemn vow to live and die together. What's it sound like? You're all muted again, but it sounds just, say it again.
Avarir.
Vartanants.
Exactly. Vartanants, exactly. It sounds just like Yelishe and Lazar describing the solemn vow, the covenant of the Holy Church. And you'd expect that this is going to be affirmed and yes, they're doing just the right thing, right? The number of those who assembled together reached about 5,000 men due to the numerous Ramigs, commoners, who joined their troops. They all proceeded from those regions to besiege the city of Theodosiopolis, which is the city of Ghewond. They blockaded the city by erecting ramparts and waged war against it throughout the entire winter season. They also built a bulwark around the city and cut holes on the outside of it, but were unable to conquer the city. Sporadically, however, they did hurl blocks of stone by means of catapults, causing some casualty in the city. What's he trying to give? So someone present is laughing. And it's meant to look ridiculous, their resistance, right? He's totally mocking it. Ashot the first, or maybe that's a mistake, Ashot, son of Prince Sahag from the house of the Bagratids, did not take part in this dangerous adventure because he was full of wisdom and prudence. On the contrary, he kept counseling the rest to abandon the perilous enterprise, which stemmed from the perverse instigation of the frenzied monk, and think of their own security as well as that of their families. He told them, "You are still young and rather immature, and I know that you are unable to resist the power of the multi-headed dragon. The power of the dragon is great, and the warriors under its command are numerous. It also possesses abundant ammunition. All those kingdoms which tried to resist its domination were totally crushed like pottery. Even the Roman Empire was unable to raise its hand against the dragon, and it still continues to tremble before it and has not dared to act against the dominical command. I do not think you are unaware of the full power, the personal courage of the Emperor of the Greeks, as well as the great number of his troops and ammunition. And yet even he did not think of delivering the land of Armenia from the dragon's hands." I am referring to Emperor Constantine, son of Leo, who in one day, while wrestling with fierce beasts, killed the lion as if he were killing goats. If Constantine himself, being so powerful, was obviously subdued by the presence of the pernicious beast which ravages the world, on whom are you relying? Or what help can you get that makes you feel powerful enough to resist the dragon's invincible force? If it pleases you, then comply with my advice, for I am only interested in your safety, as well as in the needs and quietude of our country. And this is what will happen. Either you will return and become the subjects of the Arab rule, living in your land peacefully, or you will be forced to flee from your land with your entire households, leaving behind the possessions of your ancestors, your homes, your forests and farms, and even the tombs of your forefathers, and live under the foreign yoke of the King of Greeks. Otherwise, you will simply fall into the hands of your oppressors in one day and die an insipid death, since I am well aware of the ungodly manners of the Arab caliph, who will not calm down until he has executed his will." They did not listen to this useful advice. On the contrary, they disregarded it as words of treason, since they were under the strong influence of the impostor, the monk, who constantly exhorted them to remain steadfast in their enterprise without hesitation or self-reproach. In fact, the effects of the monk's ill-advised perversity concerning his fragile resolution were immediately revealed. The Armenian nobles were soon divided amongst themselves, and it goes on to describe their failed campaign and the totally disastrous rebellion of 774 or 775, when many of the noble houses, their leading sons were killed, and some of them never recovered. Others did flee to Greek territory and never came back. It's after that rebellion that the Mamigonians kind of lose standing as being the most prominent house, because they have no more heirs, essentially, to take over. So this is totally different from the kind of perspective we'd seen before of Yelishe and Chazar. And it's very striking, right, that this monk or priest who could be saying the exact same thing in the 5th century and would be seen as, encouraging the martyrs who are going to resist against Zoroastrianism. In this text, he's portrayed as being, a frenzied monk, insane, and is only going to lead them into loss of life and, disaster. So what's going on? So this is one reason why Tim Greenwood or some scholars see a 9th century date as being where this history most belongs, as the Bagratuni is going back and sort of writing history in a way to make themselves look good in the past, or make themselves always look like the faithful servants of the Caliph who, oh yeah, we participated in that rebellion, but it was totally against our will. And really the right approach is to be faithful to the Caliph, be loyal servants, and not resist or have insurrection. Also, the part about the Greeks being so weak and unable to resist, right? So in the 8th century, in the late 8th century, there's not too much involvement directly between the Eastern Roman Empire and Armenia. But by the 9th century, the second half of the 9th, once the Macedonian dynasty comes, they're going to start pushing towards the east into Armenia, and they start engaging with Armenian nobles and seeking their support in their own campaigns to take back some territory from the caliphs and kind of expand it to Armenia. So what would reading this text at that time tell you? Well, what it's instructing you is, don't do that. That's a failing mission. They're too weak. No one can resist the power of the caliphs. And that's essentially Ghewond's message in this text, which is the Bagratuni perspective, quiescence and submission to the caliphate, because that's in the best interest of Armenia and the Armenians. And so we can stop there.